Exactly. I'm in Paris, all right.
You're in Paris right now. So we're going to get started. And before we do, I'm going to read it since it is 9/11. We're going to read a quote from Mr. Jefferson's notes on Virginia regarding war. This is a quote. Never was there so much false arithmetic employed on any subject as that which has been employed to persuade nations that it is in their interest to go to war, where the money which it has cost to gain at the close of a long war, a little town or a little territory, the right to cut wood here or to catch fish there, expended in improving what they already possess, in making roads, opening rivers, building ports, improving the arts, and finding employment for their idle poor, it would render them much stronger, much wealthier, and happier. This, I hope, will be our wisdom. From the Notes on Virginia query, it looks like 22.
Beautiful
Uh,
sentiment, huh?
that is a beautiful sentiment regarding the horrors of
If
war.
only Vladimir Putin would read that.
I agree.
Anyway, it's
Yes, and
neither here
all the
nor
other
there.
tyrants of history. So, good morning and afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Philosophical Conversations with Thomas Jefferson. The aim of this show is to get better acquainted with Thomas Jefferson as a philosopher, and through that, perhaps to get better acquainted with ourselves. I'm your host, George Gorey, formerly a captain with the California Highway Patrol and currently a criminal investigator with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Holochuk is a professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Michigan, Rutgers University Camden. He is the author, editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and has published over 300 essays, formal and informal, and has 30 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes about Ukraine. So now we're going to get into our questions, Dr. Holochuk. Question number one is, what caused Thomas Jefferson to write the notes on state of Virginia?
Well, a French diplomat by the name of Francois Barbé Marbois had prepared a list of 22 questions for a delegate, a suitable delegate from all of the states to answer. And he was the secretary. He asked Joseph Jones, who was the secretary to the Virginian delegation to Congress, to reply to these. And Jones realized that was beyond his ken, so he handed these questions over to Thomas Jefferson. Hard to believe, right? I'll read what Jefferson writes of this event in his autobiography. Before I left America, that is to say, in the year 1781, prior to going to France, that is, I received a letter from Marbois of the French legation in Philadelphia, informing me that he had been instructed by his government to obtain such statistical accounts of the different states of our Union as might be useful for their information, and addressing me to a number of queries relative to the state of Virginia. I had always made it a practice, whenever an opportunity occurred, of obtaining any information of our country which might be of use in any public station or private, to commit it to writing. These memoranda were on loose papers, bundled up without order and difficult of recurrence when I had occasion for a particular one. Hard to believe that he said without order. That's just not Thomas.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
I thought this a good occasion to embody their substance, which I did in the order of Mr. Marbois' query, so as to answer his wish and to arrange them. Notice what he says here: for my own use. No thought, at least early on at the time, of publishing these and making them available to a specific audience or even to the general public, which they happen to be. That's another large question, why they became available to the general public. That was not Jefferson's intention. It never was. So Jefferson always carried with him a notepad and took notes on anything. Imagine carrying with you all the time a notepad or even a recorder, so that you see anything sort of anything wonderful or extraordinary and you write it down. This guy was always in the service. Notice he says, what might be of use to me in a public station or private. So he's always considering something that might be useful to himself or to Virginia or even to the new country. So that's what caused him to write it. So it was, in a nutshell, it was an opportunity to take all these sort of notes that he'd been keeping about Virginia and about the early country and putting them in some order it was sort of forced. This is another instance where someone asked the question, was Jefferson very creative? No, he was not very creative, highly intelligent, but everything he really did had a precedent or some sort of exterior motivation. He seldom did things ex nihilo, from nothing. Hope that
It's a very,
got an answer to your question.
yeah, he was a very practical man in essence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Practicality was his middle name. Everything had to be practical. Knowledge,
Well,
especially.
well, in this, there's obviously the biggest, I think one of our questions here that I think is the best is what was Jefferson's view of the New World as opposed to the Old World of Buffon?
Comte de Buffon was probably the world's greatest naturalist at the time. And he had written about Jefferson's New World, talking about North and South America. And in many respects, he had nothing really nice to say about the New World, and for good reason. I mean, he thought that the New World was colder and wetter than the Old World, right? And people would say, well, how does he come to that conclusion? Well, because you haven't cleared the trees, so the sun doesn't get to to the ground as easy, so it's going to be colder. Makes sense. It's going to be wetter because any precipitation that falls with the trees all over the place, the sun's not going to be able to evaporate it. It makes it colder and wetter. In many respects, he says, because of its coldness, because of its coolth and its wetness, it's inferior. And all the vegetation it has is going to be inferior because of the coldness and wetness. And Jefferson comes back rather cleverly and says, well, look, when we see vegetation thriving, then we see animal life thriving. And under what conditions does vegetation thrive? It's when it's hot and wet. So he says America's cold and wet, so it's at least got one of the conditions for thriving. And if that means that the New World is drier and hotter, then it too has only one of the conditions. So is there any really reason to believe that the New World's inferior? So in some sense, this can be taken, Buffon's criticism of the New World can be taken as an indictment of the New World. So why do people want to go out there, land of the free or something? Yeah, it's land of cold and wet. It's land of inferior vegetation, inferior animality. And Abbe Raynal even says that people there are inferior. The Native Americans and people who migrate there are inferior. They shrink, they get less robust. There's a cute story about Benjamin Franklin discussing Raynal's thesis. I think Raynal might have been in the room. I don't remember. But Franklin's there with a couple of Americans in France, and there are a few Frenchmen around the table. And he says, well, interesting thesis that, the people will shrink and be less robust in the New World. He goes, well, look, there are three of us Americans here and a few or handful of you French, and we all seem to be bigger than you. So how do you explain that? Anyways, so, when Jefferson writes of, I have my notes on Virginia somewhere here, he writes of, and he aims to, a lot of people say, refute Buffon. And he doesn't try to do that. So he has in his book, Notes on Virginia, in query 4, he talks of 3 tables. He's comparing animals from both. And, aboriginals of both, and he has aboriginals of only one, then he has lastly, domesticated animals in both. And he goes on to show that the animals in the New World, he's taken the average size of animals from the Old World and comparing them to the largest known animal of the same sort in the New World. And you'd say, well, that's stacking the deck. And Jefferson said, that's fine to do that because if I show that the average cow weighs X number of pounds in the Old World, and I've seen a cow that weighs, I don't know, 700 pounds or 800 pounds, and I don't know what cows weigh, 800 pounds in the New World, but much larger, even if that's just an anomaly, but that's not supposed to happen because of the climate, right? And I want you to focus on here. And then he starts off his refutation of Buffon with the bones of the woolly mammoth. Nothing like that known in Europe. So how did such a big animal come to exist in the New World. He thought that the mammoth at the time still existed because he thought with the economy of nature, nature doesn't create things and let them go extinct. Actually, Aristotle said, by the way, if extinction were a possibility, and there'd be some point in time where all things could go extinct, and Aristotle says that clearly is not the case. Well, Aristotle was wrong, but so that's in some sense Jefferson. And what everybody misses here is they often talk about Jefferson's refutation of Buffon. And there's one sentence in there where Jefferson says, "My aim is not to refute Buffon." Not to refute Buffon, but to offer a suspense of judgment till more evidence can be brought up to clarify this issue. Right? One sentence can change the whole scholarly debate. Everybody seems to have missed that, but I haven't. I noted that in my book.
Yeah, because don't the scholars all say that that's what he was trying to do, refute Buffon?
Yeah, everybody says that, and it seems like if you read it carefully, that's what he's doing. But all he's trying to say is no. What I'm trying to show is that there is a strong argument to be made that the New World is not inferior. He's admitting, like a good scientist, is that the evidence I have at my disposal is sort of biased, right? It's incomplete. So, but if you look at what I have to offer, it casts doubt on Buffon's claims, and that's what he's happy with that. It's like two boxers fighting. And you see one at the end of the day, the one person's really just fighting for a draw. The strategy is to draw. And that's what I think he does a wonderful job of suspending judgment, if not refuting Buffon.
Which makes sense. That would be his scientific outlook.
Yes.
What was Thomas Jefferson's, this is question number 3, view on Virginia's current culture and what he thought should be done to improve society? Because he obviously talks about that in the notes.
I'm not sure that the goal, in some measure, Jefferson's goal was normative, in that he's arguing to this is what we need to do to improve society. That's the thesis of Gish and Klinghardt, that he's arguing for republicanism. I'll talk about this later, that he's really trying to it's a political manifesto, and he's trying to argue for republicanism. So what he's doing in the notes is really underlining, showcasing Jeffersonian republicanism as an alternative, say, to autocracies, to aristocracies and things like that. I think that's wrong. So I don't think I think he's offering us a picture of the past of Virginia, and to some measure the past of early America, colonial America. He's offering a snapshot of what's going on today. Like he talks about the laws of Virginia, he talks about the history of Virginia, the animals of Virginia. But I don't think his ultimate goal is that he's pushing necessarily. I think he's being more of a scientist and not necessarily pushing for reforms, other than the fact that he makes some passing philosophical comments. As you know, you just read one, right? War is stupid. And he puts that in there. Does that need to be put in? It's an aside, but it's an important aside. A lot of people think, sometimes war is necessary. And he's, as you just read, it's for him, it's quite stupid. It's all the money you spend on war, the loss of lives we could be working on internal improvements and things for the betterment of your own country or your own state, whatever. And there is the paean, the song of praise, as it were, to agrarianism, where he says, people who work the land are the chosen people of God.
Right.
It's beautiful. And in some sense, there he's arguing for, he talks about America hopefully being a nation of farmers. And he considers, in one sense, he says, well, look, what if half of us farmed and half of us devoted ourselves to manufacture? Then he argues, well, most of the things manufactured are not really needed. So it'd be better if we just devoted ourselves exclusively to farming and take our farm goods and export them to other countries as they need our farm goods, and grow as a nation that way. I'll think of how different, in some sense, he thinks that this is going to keep us free and independent from the broils and the skirmishes and the wars of Europe if we don't engage in manufacture of goods and we don't exchange manufactured goods. We don't get involved. We just give them our food and we import whatever manufactured goods like plows and whatever things important for farming that we need. Um, that said, he does understand like the New England coastal areas are going to be doing whaling and things like that. So um, I don't see that he's arguing for the improvement of American society necessarily. He is offering philosophical nuggets and suggestions that if we go in this agricultural direction, that's better for America, and that keeps us independent of the stupid wars of Europe, especially between France and England. I don't know. You have any
I
ideas
was
on
going to
that
say
yourself?
his view of agrarianism was that agrarianism was a very it was perfectible with republicanism, right? It contributed to a republican government. The more agrarian a society was.
Well, I think he early on he wanted us to be completely agrarian.
Yes, I
And
believe the
so the
same thing.
idea is that you talk about independency. If everybody say, if most people owned a small farm, like Monticello was a large farm, but you're going to try to be as self-sufficient as you can. Jefferson makes his own ice cream. He takes ice from the river and uses that for other stuff. You grow your own food. You had a nailery. You make all the things that you need. You can make your own plows and things like that, or buy them from someone nearby. But you try to be as independent as you want. And he thinks farmers are the most independent, and they engage in an occupation that is very fruitful. He talks about throwing few seeds in the ground, and the abundance of crop that you get. What he doesn't talk about, of course, to dampen the argument, is the difficulty of farming, the droughts, the flooding, right, and the things that happen
Not easy to be a
that
farmer.
no, and
Definitely not easy.
he could it could be said he really wasn't a very good farmer. I mean, some neighbors asked
Right.
that how was Jefferson a farmer? He was not very good. He read a lot of books. He could have been really good, but he was always away on political duties to oversee his farm and be considered a good. And one thing is, he was more of a theoretical farmer. He farmed from books more than, to some extent, he at least the criticism was he used books to farm instead of just going out there and examining the fields and using experience. But I'm not sure that that's a fair assessment because he just was never around his fields enough to be able to work the fields or study the fields.
All that dedication of his life to public service took time away from his farm and his family.
Yeah, and he that's a big point that most people miss, like, well, he's out there because of fame, because of desire for power. Well, that's all bullshit. He was away from, and this was all contributing to debt as well, because the fields, when he came back after his presidency, his fields were terrible. They were poorly managed, and he had to start, in a manner of speaking, he had to start from scratch to try to get them back so they're making money for him. No small beer there.
Oh. And I think a lot of that not so being so good with farming unfortunately contributed to his poverty later in life, right? The inability to make as much money as he possibly could have, right?
Yeah, that goes without saying. I mean,
Yeah,
if
unfortunately.
if he had stayed home and managed his fields and made them the focal point of his life, he may never have gotten into. He got into a substantial part of debt by marrying. He married into debt. He got Wales's. When Wales died, that's part of the reason that he bought into the principle of generational sovereignty. So, the debt of one generation ought not to be the debt of another. Part of it, is that he inherited Wales's massive debt. He got his slaves, but he also got his massive debt, and it took him a long time to dig out of that.
Yeah. Affected his life tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
And the future of Monticello, actually.
Yeah.
So number four is, what was the quote unquote underlying narrative throughout the notes?
There was no underlying narrative. I'll explain. This is my thesis in my criticism of Notes on Virginia. Do you have that book? By the way, I don't even know.
I do. I do.
You have a copy of it? Okay. But I don't have a copy right now. I just have it on my computer. I think I got an early version of it that it's not perfectly edited. He writes at the beginning of Notes on Virginia in what's called an advertisement. He says, the following notes, again, here's another instance. I always say take Jefferson literally. We can't take him literally because knowing him, knowing his anality, this is just not Jefferson. They were written in Virginia in the year 1781 and somewhat corrected after his stint as governor, somewhat corrected and enlarged in the winter of 1782. In answer to queries proposed to the author by a foreigner of distinction, then residing among us. The subjects are all treated imperfectly, some scarcely touched on. To apologize for this by developing the circumstances of the time and place of their composition would be the open wounds which have already bled enough. To these circumstances, some of their imperfections may with truth be ascribed, great mass to the want of information and want of talents in the writer. So he says, whoever finds fault with my notes can just blame me. I didn't do enough research and I'm not that talented of a writer. Now, I find this hard to take seriously because we know Jefferson. Everything had to be ordered perfectly, everything arranged perfectly. When he's writing his declaration, every sentence had to be thrown in perfectly. Now, this is not, the book is not ordered perfectly neatly, but nonetheless, I I challenge the notion that he didn't do enough work here. Now, a lot of people say, I've read a lot of people say, well, he's just being a damned hypocrite, right? He just wants to deflect any criticisms on anything he says, say something on slavery. He's got an out here because he just didn't do enough research. I counter this way, and it's a very good counter. Have you ever tried to write something like that? Try to write your own notes on the state of California.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Okay. Even, if you lived 100 years ago, you're going to write something like this because you're going to miss stuff. You can't cover everything and you can't cover it perfectly. So it's very easy for people to read it and say, well, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. What I find astonishingly is he made so few mistakes.
Yes.
That's
a monumental project.
No one talks about. None of the people who are hypercritical, Peter Onuf and the critical, the notes is not very interesting, blah, blah, blah. They don't look at the toughness that goes into writing something, the degree of difficulty in the task. Now, there are two theses I talk about. The first I call the alphabet soup thesis. It's that the work is a hodgepodge that's thrown together. It's not well organized and it's atypical of Jefferson. And it follows Jefferson in his advertisement. That Jefferson does not think much of this. It's just sort of like some things thrown together to answer questions. Who endorses this? Gilbert Chenard, Dumas Malone, Merrill Peterson, Douglas Wilson, among others, and the great Peter Onuf. That's what Onuf says. My favorite Jeffersonian historian, as one scholar said, the horse's ass. Onuf says, what is most remarkable about the literature on this omnium gatherum? Omnium gatherum is just stuff thrown together. Never completed bag of a book. It's not even a book, it's a bag of a book. Is the extraordinary range of formal interpretive schemes, legal, natural, scientific, pedagogic, and other, that have been offered by critical readers. And what does he mean, been offered by critical readers? That have been criticized by readers, I think. Jefferson is the one who wrote it, not the critical readers. That all these readings make some sense is indicative of the richness of the notes. They also suggest that Jefferson did not have the same control over his multiple voices that he usually displays in his correspondence. People who write from the postmodernist perspective all are fond of saying is that even our own personality is in disarray. We all have multiple voices, and Onuf always loves to talk about Jefferson's multiple voices, that when someone writes him a letter on farming, he talks about farming, someone on law. And at the end of the day, there's no real person behind the multiple voices. And so what does it mean to have control over multiple voices? It means to be a unified creature behind the voices, that there's a genuine self behind the voices, right? But he didn't have
FaceTime video.
he didn't have control. I don't even know what enough talking about own stupidity. So there's the deconstructionist thesis that, when you look at the work as a whole, it doesn't seem to have any order, but you need to deconstruct, right? There's no manifest thread, but there is, beyond the surface, a latent thread, a latent thesis. Now, my favorite, and at the end of my book, you'll see in Appendix 2, I offer a book review. Why do I write books? Why did I write this book? I wrote this book because I read Dustin Gish and David Klingard's book on Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which I found to be an embarrassment. I had a friend of mine, a scholar, read the book and send it to me and say, you got to read this. This is a fantastic book. I found it to be a train wreck of a book. They argue that Jefferson's book is a political manifesto. Everything in the book points in the direction of Jefferson pushing his republicanism. Well, one refutation of that, the first 7 queries: boundaries of Virginia, the rivers, the seaports, the mountains, the Cascades, productions, mineral, vegetable, animal, climate, population. What does any of that have to do with Jeffersonian republicanism? All naturalistic themes. So they argue that it's predominantly a political manifesto, and within the boundaries of that political manifesto, there's a political element, a religious element, and an historical element. I think the third one is. So if the whole thing is really a political manifesto, then why break the political manifesto into 3 components, 2 of which are not political? Anyways,
Right.
I don't get. I mean, if you read you're probably going to want to read I just destroy it. I'll read a couple snippets from that. They say, when read carefully with attention to form and content, the notes reveals a much more relevant political purpose than the compilation view, which is my alphabet soup thesis, alone allows. A coherent literary structure binds the whole together. In other words, there is a thread, unifying disparate subject matter and highlighting consistent themes throughout. It is, in fact, Jefferson's most sustained effort to outline a coherent vision of Republican constitutionalism. I've already said I don't understand how the naturalistic queries 1 through 7 have anything to do with republicanism. When he's talking about the natural bridge, how does that have to do with republicanism? So the thesis doesn't hold. Then they talk about the Bible. They talk about, if we look at the natural, the social, and political structure of Virginia, that is a format that, quote, mimics the order and substantive concerns of the Pentateuch in the Old Testament.
Right.
So in effect, they argue Jefferson is aiming to supplant the authority of the Old Testament and replace it with a secular Old Testament, Jefferson's notes. So Jefferson is basically, in some sense, aiming to replace at least the Old Testament of the Bible. And it's like, you don't need to read the Old Testament. Just read my notes on Virginia. How the hell do you come up with that?
That actually doesn't even make sense.
What were you
doesn't
drinking?
Even make sense.
Were you fasting for 10 straight days when you wrote this? So literally in some sense, and that happened with Jefferson's letters to his brother Randolph. Sometimes I'll read a biography or a book where, in my estimation, at least, you can read my book and tell me if I'm right or wrong. People get things so wrong, and when there's nothing else out there to be offered as a corrective, I'll write a book. And that's why I included that Appendix 2, where it's like a 5 or 6 page refutation of their book, right? If it's the only thing out there, you're going to read it and you're going to take it as gospel. And I think that's really, really bad.
It makes sense. And I've never heard of that thesis that it was trying to replace the Bible.
Pentateuch, right?
That
the
is
5
unbelievable.
books.
The 5 books of the Old Testament.
Where are the 5 books in Jefferson's? Where are the 5 sections here? Anna dia tia tessera penda. Penda in Greek is 5. The Pentateuch is the 5. There's nothing 5 that they point out. I don't know, but you got to be smoking the right thing.
I guess so. So that leads us to 5, and you touched on this already. What have modern scholars missed in their review and in the interpretation of the notes?
Well, here's my thesis, and I can't be sure my thesis is correct. I think it's the best thesis out there. Also, otherwise, I wouldn't have written the book. But it might be open to critical investigation. I always openly embrace criticism of my work, right? I think at least if I'm wrong in what I say, and I'll elaborate in a bit, it's interestingly wrong. In other words, someone needs to come over and say, okay, you got this. It's better than the other theses, but still there are flaws. I'm
Right.
going to offer an alternative. And I'm always happy with that. Anyways, I think if you take a bird's eye view, whenever I read a book, I take the bird's eye view. I look at the title, table of contents, all the chapters, and I try to look for the thread, for the thesis. There's no real thesis or thread here. But I think, following some of the people on the alphabet soup thesis, that it's an historical, it's a guidebook to Virginia in other parts of the country, and it has historical and critical content. That takes us into Jefferson's, as I like to call it, cavernous mind. So, I mean, if you read it from the perspective of a lot of philosophical nuggets, a lot of, let's try to understand what goes on in Jefferson's head from psychoanalytic point of view, you are abundantly rewarded. Jefferson immerses himself in minutiae and details all the time. And it's a beautiful book for the sort of person who might like to read Darwin's Origin of Species, all these facts and details and things. It requires patient scientific reader. Now, the first, I said there are two parts. In Greek antiquity, they talk the physis. That's how they pronounce it. We get our word physics from it, P-H-U-S-I-S to transliterate, which is nature. And then the 16 other queries are nomos, which is culture. And in Greek antiquity, there was always this dialectic or fight between culture and nature. And the Stoics would say, and even Aristotle would say, is that if you're going to ask people to behave in such a way, say morally, that goes against their nature, physis, it's not going to work. We have to study nature to understand culture. So I think the work moves from nature to culture, but the process is dialectical, right? It invites us, we don't have to read it from cover to cover. We can look at, for example, the chapter on climate, query 7, right? But then when we go to manners, query 18, or religion, query 17, it is dialectical. It invites us to go back and look at that. Now, why? Well, if we are in a mountainous area, if we are by a river, if we're in a dry climate, it's going to affect our customs. It's going to affect our laws. Where does Jefferson get that from? He gets it from Aristotle. He gets it from Plato. He gets it from the Hippocratic physicians of antiquity, both in Greek and Roman antiquity. There's a wonderful work called Airs, Waters, and Places, which Aristotle, writes very similarly, talking about if we want to understand health, we have to understand the water people drink, the air that they breathe, and the place in which they live. It's what's going on in Notes on Virginia. Jefferson is looking at Hippocratic medicine in some sense, saying, okay, you want to understand what goes on in Virginia? We have to talk about the climate, the temperature. We have to talk about the animals, right? Because that's going to affect our culture. There's the dialectical. And I think this is a really cool thesis. How do climate and environment interact? So there's the dialectical. One can read climate, then go back to mannerisms or culture or religion, and then go back to whatever aspect of early physical Virginia. Right. There's an interplay going on. So that's what I mean. I don't mean the dry sort of dialectic we get in deconstructionist bullshit, of the German sort, which I always found terrible. Ideally, what Gish and Klinghardt say, that there is in some sense a small paean to republicanism, is probably true in some parts of it. Jefferson certainly, but Gish and Klinghardt always argue, and I think this is just incredibly wrong, that what Jefferson was really doing when he wanted to print up the 200 copies, send them back to Virginia, is he wanted them all to go to the Constitutional Convention where they're discussing the new Constitution so that it could be a Jeffersonian republic. And where does Jefferson ever say that? Nowhere. In none of
Never,
his letters did he talk about that. He said, I'm going to print up a
never.
few, couple hundred copies, and we'll send some to William and Mary. I'll send some to choice friends. I'll send some to my buddy Williamos, who's the spy. I talk about this
That's
in this
right, the
book.
spy.
Other than that, I mean, how does that sound reasonable to you? I don't know.
It
I
does
like
to
the
me, and
thesis.
it does to me. I think that thesis makes sense because he was a man of many views and talents, and he liked to look at an issue, as you said, dialectically. He looked at the entire issue and took all the moving parts, putting it into place to see how one affected the other. And I think that is the thesis. I think all the other stuff is just white noise, to be honest with you. All the other ones that
And
he
it's a
named.
guidebook, right? It's a
It is a
guidebook.
guidebook.
It's meant to give us a snapshot of Virginia at the time with a picture of the history. He always saved Virginia's laws. He collected the laws from ancient Virginia. He wants to keep for posterity a picture of Virginia that other people can use. It's a guidebook. And
And
of course, it's going to
it's not
become
wholly inclusive. It can't be,
no,
right?
and it's going to be a snapshot, and it's going to be replaced at some point. And he's happy with that. But the fact that he is somewhat skeptical about the completeness of the book, it's just natural because the project is overwhelmingly large. No
Yeah,
one could give you a
exactly.
perfect picture. I mean,
Monumental.
that's the answer to the last one. I don't know if you have any thoughts, or if you want, you can tell us what we're
No,
going to do next week. If you have any closing
let's
thoughts, that'd be fun.
no, I think that no, I think it was a great. This was a great show. I think this is a very this is one of his great works, and I think it is grossly misunderstood. I
One
was
of
not
the
aware.
great works of his day, of the early republic. It's
Absolutely,
just not. It's not. It's never going to get the fanfare because it appeals to the scientific intellect, the person who's going to do as I say, to write good history, get your fingers dirty into the ground. And
right, and
people
that's why
don't
I think
like
a
to
lot of them
read
don't.
that.
They don't, and especially modern people is it's not they were men of. He was a man of letters, right? A man of letters,
Yeah,
writing to people who were people of letters, right? Men of letters. And so I think today it's a struggle for people, but there's much wisdom to be found in it. And you hit the nail on the head. It is a monumental project. I mean, it was a monumental project to undertake at the time.
extraordinary successful too, successfully
Yes,
done. Yeah, and
yes,
people just don't realize the extent to which it's one of the great works of his day, especially in
absolutely.
America. Other Frenchmen and other people from other nations who read it understood that this is a great
They
work
did.
by the great. Talk about the Declaration of Independence. This was a second feather in his cap as to other people at times as important as the Declaration.
Absolutely. Well,
All
we're
right, what are
almost
we
out of
doing
time
next
here.
week?
Next week, it looks like the Colonel received an email from a viewer concerning Thomas Jefferson's alleged affair with Sally Hemings. Says the viewer, quote, I recently found this account by Israel Jefferson in the Virginia Humanities Collection. Israel does state that Jefferson had intimate relations with Hemings. It seems pretty clear and convincing since Israel was around Jefferson a lot and worked in his private chambers at Monticello. This is hugely disappointing to me, crushing actually. Why would Israel make this up? Do you have any information on his claim, and have you seen this account? Any insight is greatly appreciated, unquote. Next week, we will discuss Israel's account.
Is this so unsettling? Is there an out, or was Jefferson a hypocrite that he had passionate sex with Sally Hemings?
Right.
All right, great
All right.
show. Thank you
Great
for your
job, Colonel.
input and your wonderful questions and comments as usual.
Thank you,
TTFN.
sir.